I know what caused the eruption of Hollow Zero. Well, maybe. Probably. Okay, well, initially I set out to talk about the backstory of Wise and Bell because we finally got some more information about where they came from, their motivations, and the name of their mysterious teacher, who is also apparently the one held responsible for the eruption of Hollow Zero, and thus the destruction of the old capital. And that in itself is a pretty big reveal, and I wanted to talk about it. Little did I know that this was a gateway to something much, much bigger. Because in trying to learn more about this mysterious Carole Arna, I ended up with a corkboard full of strings connecting hollow research to the sacrifice to music to an ancient conflict to time travel and even the name of a faction that has, up until this point, flown completely under the radar, and I'm quite impressed by it actually. And as a result, now, more than ever, I am convinced that Zenless Zone Zero is about to get really wild. I don't even know how to explain what I'm intending to talk about today, and I hardly know where to begin because everything is so deeply interconnected I could really start anywhere and end up at the same place. So forgive me if I just lay this whole thing out chronologically and start at the very, very beginning. And I do mean the very beginning, because we're going to talk about the time before the founding of the old capital, a time before Eridu itself. Because there was a civilization that predated Eridu. Now, it doesn't have an official name, unfortunately. It's usually just called the Old Civilization, or more broadly referred to with terms like ancient or lost, which isn't particularly helpful. But we do have enough little bits and fragments of information that we can use to make some inferences about this era. For example, we know that this era had extremely advanced technology because most of the super advanced technology that we see in new Eridu, such as the AI constructs like Qingyi, Billy, and even the HDD, come from that era. We'll talk about this more later on. But the other thing that we know is that this era fizzled out a long time before the founding of Eridu, hence the term ancient or lost. Now, the Where the Miracle Began trailer describes the events of Eridu's founding. There were 7 heroes known as the Void Hunters who successfully managed to suppress the Hollow catastrophe to create a safe location in order to establish a city. And since Eridu could only be founded because of successful Hollow suppression, we can only assume humanity was struggling like heck against it previously, and that makes it quite likely that the ancient era ended with the arrival of the Hollows. I'm assuming this would have been humanity's first encounter with the Hollows, and based on what we know about the Hollows currently, I think an unknown encounter with a disaster of that scale would have undoubtedly caused unprecedented chaos and destruction. Now, you'd think that the survivors of such a disaster would come together and form a united coalition, right? And yeah, some of them did. There were people who wanted the Hollows to be suppressed, controlled, or outright eradicated, and they would end up following those with the means to make that happen, and those people were the Void Hunters. However, it appears as though there were a group of people who saw the Hollows a little differently, and these people believed that the Hollows were something more like a divine gift, and they thought that they should embrace the Hollows and let them consume humanity entirely. Now, you might be thinking, there is literally no evidence for Hollow worshippers existing way back then, and that's where you would be wrong. Because, the evidence is actually in the same trailer that tells us about the Void Hunters. Right about here. You see this? This Void Hunter is Miyabi's ancestor, and her most noteworthy achievement is taking down something called the Exaltist Overseer. Now, many, myself included, initially thought that this was the name of the big old monster-looking things in the background. But I now think that the Exaltist Overseer is actually the leader of a Hollow-worshipping faction that thrived during the chaos that followed the fall of the Ancient Era. That's a pretty big claim, so allow me to explain. In the Roaming the Ether event, Nicole gives us a salvaged laptop, and we try to get the data off of it by fighting off all of the viruses that are inside. Doing so nets us a series of journal entries that were written by a guy nicknamed Spacebar. Now, Spacebar was a member of the Eridu Defense Force from over 10 years ago, and that number is very important because 10 years ago is when Hollow Zero erupted. Now, the journal entries are pretty uneventful up through number 6, as they mostly detail Spacebar's experience in the military, but in journal number 7, he mentions a group of weirdly dressed citizens and wonders if, quote, these kinds of heretics are still around these days. Still around these days implies that they've been around for a long time previously. He identifies these people as belonging to a, quote, order, which uses a capital letter, so it's a proper noun. It's the name of an organization. And as the journal entries continue, Spacebar documents the eruption of Hollow Zero and how he was trapped inside with a limited supply of anti-corruption supplies. But during this time, within the Hollow, Spacebar seems to catch sight of these members of the order that he saw before the eruption. And the longer he stays in the Hollow, the more the effects of corruption start to take their toll on him. And this is accompanied by him thinking more and more about the order and their teachings, until finally, in the last entry of his journal, he says he wants to, quote, spread the gospel of the order. And for that, he has to leave the hollow, which he then describes as a fairyland. And from this, we can infer that this mysterious order appears to worship the hollows and that they encourage its spread. And this makes them diametrically opposed to the Void Hunters and their affiliates, which is basically everyone in New Eridu. And this is kind of what I meant earlier when I talked about humanity splitting into two factions after the fall of the Ancient Era. I think the arrival of the hollows kind of incited a sort of ideological war between those who wanted to embrace the hollows and those who rejected the hollows, and I think the order was winning. That is, until Miyabi's ancestor killed their leader, because that's who I think the Exaltist Overseer is, and I think those monsters in the background here are actually giant ethereals that they may have been commanding. After all, someone who worships a hollow may have some level of control over the stuff inside of them, right? Now this connection might seem like a pretty massive leap, so let's break down how I actually got there. Now, Reddit user ObviousLow3967 pointed out that the Order has actually been mentioned twice before the Roaming the Ether event, once in the Where the Miracle Began trailer and once in the exploration mission called The Prophecy, but you'd probably only make this connection if you play in Chinese. So you probably figured out that the mention in the Where the Miracle Began trailer is the Exaltus Overseer, right? Well, let's take a closer look at that. While Exaltus Overseer is a pretty literal translation, there are some nuances that get missed, because a more literal translation is something more like praise meeting bishop, or even exaltist bishop, because a meeting of people who want to praise or worship or elevate someone is what you would call exalting. I'm mentioning this because it's relevant, and also make sure you're paying attention to these Chinese characters because they are also relevant. Now, in the prophecy mission, the trash can prophet mentions how the ode shall resonate throughout New Eridu, but the Chinese text for ode was actually this, which roughly means hymn. You'll notice a matching character between this and praise meeting bishop. Now, an ode and a hymn are pretty interchangeable terms, as both describe a type of song or poem that praises or elevates a given subject. But a hymn has more religious connotations, and I think that actually matters here given how Overseer was originally written as bishop. And to be honest with you, I have no idea how they ended up with Overseer as a translation for bishop. As far as I can tell, there's no direct correlation. And in Chinese, this is a pretty explicit reference to a position of a church. But anyway, let's circle back to Spacebar's mention of the heretical hollow worshipping order that he saw. Because apart from knowing them as the order, he only remembers one other word that relates to them, and that word was translated into chant in English. However, in Chinese it uses a familiar character, the same one that was used for hymn or ode earlier. Now, if you combine the characters that Spacebar used for the order and the chant, you're gonna get something that's quite close to praise meeting, which connects it to the praise meeting bishop that Miyabi's ancestor killed. And now that I think about it, that is a lot of religious references there. We've got bishops and hymns and prophets spreading the gospel. You gotta admit, the terminology is pretty biblical. Now, with all this information in hand, Spacebar's initial reaction of calling the Order a bunch of heretics makes more sense, right? They're a religious group. They worship the Hollows, and if the Void Hunters don't like these guys, and spoilers, they don't, and Spacebar is part of the Defense Force, which is the military, which is part of the faction that aligns with the Void Hunters, then it makes sense for the Order to be considered heretics by the general populace, and it also makes sense why Spacebar wondered why the Order was still around. They're an old faction. They predate the founding of Eridu. And actually, I think that there's evidence that this faction is not only still around, but is still quite active, and not just because of the Prophecy Exploration quest, which they got mentioned in, although we will come back to that. It's just that, like, logically speaking, a faction that worships the Hollows likely believes in finding a method of, like, fusing with the Hollows, right? Like becoming one with the Hollows, getting swallowed by them, but still somehow maintaining a sense of consciousness. And that made me think of that sacrifice monster that appeared the night before the Hollow Zero eruption. That thing was a weird blend of human and ethereal, and it appears to be part of a bigger project. And the kicker is that in Chinese, it is called a, quote, livestock demon ghost, which kind of makes it a sort of sacrificial lamb, if you will, which is also a phrase with biblical roots. It's actually how you refer to someone or something that is sacrificed for the greater good. That feels pretty fitting, doesn't it? And funnily enough, the faction that wants to recover the remains of the sacrificial lamb is the one that Sarah belongs to. And I'm starting to suspect that she is part of the Exaltus Order, if only because of her name. Sarah is a name borrowed from a biblical matriarch, the wife of Abraham, and etymologically speaking, it means minister. Reminds me a bit of this Exaltist bishop, you know? And Sarah is also apparently a shortened version of the name Seraphim, which is a type of angel, and I probably didn't need to explain that to you, but here we are, and while we're here, I'm also going to point out that Seraphim are known for singing songs of praise to God. They hover around his throne singing holy, holy, holy. Now you might think that all these mentions of the songs and hymns and odes and chants are just part of the Exaltus Order's religious practices, and you'd be half right. But only half right, because I think the reason why they lean so heavily into the song aspect is because music is also a property of a hollow. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Zenless actually puts a very subtle emphasis on the importance of music. Take a look at the gameplay mechanics. W engines are actually just ether-powered music players. They're just boom boxes. Their whole job is to boost an operator's combat capabilities within a hollow using sound, which might be why we generate decibels, which allow us to unleash ultimate attacks. In fact, these W engines play the music discs that we get from Elfie. They're playing those songs. Different discs have different songs, and different songs have different effects. And interestingly enough, those discs are also ether-plated. And then we have this really weird interaction with Fairy in the Prophecy Hollow. In trying to explain her change in the way she speaks, Fairy says, whichever hollow you're in, sing its song. And this brings me back to Carole, because she's named after a type of song. Well, technically a type of hymn. You know, a song of praise, like the Exaltists sing. Now, Carole Arna was a lead researcher at the Helios Academy, as well as both a parental figure and a teacher for Belle and Wise, who considered the Academy their home. Now, I think we can safely assume that Carole was researching hollows, not just because she helped develop the HDD, which we're going to come back to in a second, but also because hollow research was what the founder of the Helios Academy was known for. In fact, the founder of the Academy, Professor Archie, was a void hunter who entered Hollow Zero in order to learn the true nature of the hollows, only to never be seen again. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that the research facility he left behind was also continuing on his research. Which brings us to the HDD, a computer system that was developed by Carole Arna as a means of navigating the hollows in real time. We're told as much by Belle and Wise, but what you might not know is that the HDD was actually constructed using technology from the ancient era, and it was also constructed with the assistance of both Belle and Wise. But as far as I can tell, the actual technology that they salvaged from inside the hollow that came from the ancient era was called sensory sync. This technology is something that allows your consciousness to project into an external device so that you can control it remotely. This is how the siblings pilot Eos within the hollows. But the funny thing is, the sensory sync technology may have been pretty widespread back in the ancient era, as Qingyi, who is also an ancient automaton, is also equipped with this exact same technology despite having never met Carole Arna, meaning the sensory sync is not unique to Carole's research. But what's even more interesting is that Qingyi is compatible with not just sensory sync, but any bangbu, and she sometimes refers to herself as just a big bangbu. She even uses the same charging stations, and she can swap her consciousness with other bangbu at will. And this leads me to believe that bangbu were actually developed based on technology that was also salvaged from the ancient era. And what's curious about this is that currently AIs and other digital consciousnesses are closely linked to etheric matter that's found within the hollows. This has been explicitly illustrated several times with Grace. Part of her AI development process is taking the machines into a hollow so that they can be exposed to ether and therefore awaken to their own individual consciousnesses. You know something funny? Grace is also named after the song Amazing Grace because completing her agent mission nets you the achievement, The Amazing Grace, and that too is a song of religious praise. And curiously, Grace's teacher appears to be the same guy from the Where the Miracle Began trailer, which directly and explicitly connects him to the 4 AI keys, you know, like Fairy. And Fairy was originally in the hands of the White Star Institute, who were also responsible for the discovery and restoration of Qingyi, which suggests that their area of research was similar to that of the Helios Academy. Both were recovering and studying ancient era technology. So now there's this weird link between music and the concept of the mind, or at least the digital mind. The whole relationship is still kind of weird when you think about it because technically speaking, humans and computers just think differently. Like, humans are very emotional creatures, and stuff like music is used to easily alter our emotional state, which then changes the way that we think by altering our brain chemistry. But computers don't have brain chemicals and therefore are not naturally emotional. And unlike humans, computers think in math. But technically speaking, your conscious mind should be able to be digitized into math. And if your mind can be made into math, then why is this focus on music so important? It's not like music is affecting the mathematics of a computer's mental state, right? Actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because technically speaking, music is just math expressed over the dimension of time. This is one of the foundational principles of the Pythagorean theory of the music of the spheres, something I think that Zenless is going to start leaning heavily into more and more as we go along, because the theory actually describes the relationship between math and music, and uses that relationship to explain how reality functions. And it also includes spheres, and hollows are spheres with music that alters the math of the AIs that it helps create. And the more I think about it, the funnier it becomes that our protagonists' names are Bell and Wise. You know, bell like the instrument and wise as a description of some aspect of the mind. And before you ask, yes, it's the same in Chinese. Definitely a deliberate choice. I'm gonna leave it a little bit surface level for now, but at least the relationships between hollows, music, and AIs, or at least digital consciousnesses, should become a little bit clearer. But the prevalence of this sort of technology and research that's found in the ancient era kind of suggests to me that the ancient era people may have been messing around with something related to consciousness and reality-altering math music that may or may not have triggered the first hollow disaster, the details of which I'm not actually going to speculate on. But you might be wondering how all of this relates to how or why Carole Arna specifically was accused of causing the eruption of Hollow Zero 10 years ago. And frankly, I think this has to do with the whole prophet trope. And physics, because there's prophecies in the physics, specifically in the third part of the math music over time thing. The time part. So, okay, hollows have a lot of similarities to black holes, not just visually, but behaviorally. Because of their intense gravity, the space around black holes tends to get stretched, and if space stretches, time stretches. This leads to time dilations that can get more and more extreme as you go deeper into a black hole. And eventually, you'll go so deep that the properties of space and time flip. I'm not going to go too into the weeds on this or the math, but if you think of normal space as being something that you can traverse in any direction, and normal time as being a linear constant that you can only traverse in one direction, then inside of a black hole, this flips. And space becomes the linear constant that you can only go in one direction with, and time can suddenly be traversed in any direction. Remember the time thing for later. Hollows express this flipping of space-time in a couple of ways. For example, space within a hollow becomes warped and distorted, resulting in a sort of nearly infinite labyrinth, a singular path with no end. That's basically space becoming a linear constant. As for time, well, we have evidence of time dilations thanks to the race in the Outer Ring. That in-hollow broadcast of the race to an outside audience came with a 10-minute time delay, which they boasted as being a very small delay, which suggests that standard delays should be a lot larger than that. Now, the game has said a bunch of times that sending and receiving messages from within a hollow is impossible, or nearly impossible, and yet we have this live broadcast, and basically the entirety of the Scott Outpost, which contradicts this statement. But I think that the reason why messages can't generally be sent reliably is because of time dilation. See, message-sending machines require absolute values in order to function, and if space-time is wibbly-wobbly, something like a cell phone isn't going to know where or when to send a message. It's going to need some sort of reference point, and that's where data piles come in. Data piles basically function like anchor points within a hollow space-time. You can think of them like pins on a map that provide stable and reliable reference points that allow for messages to be sent while also aiding in hollow navigation. This means that if you have a hollow with a data pile in them, you can likely use that data pile to send a message, or to gather map data. And the more data piles you have, the better your chance of sending a message with low time delay will be. At least that's how I think it works. Now, this wibbly-wobbly space-time flipperoo has one very interesting side effect to it. Because time is no longer a linear constant and can therefore be theoretically traversed in any direction, time travel within a black hole is possible, which means it should be possible within a hollow as well, but with a small catch. both hollows and black holes are self-contained bubbles, if you will, and that means you can only traverse the time and space that the black hole or hollow has swallowed. So for example, if a black hole appeared after the dinosaurs disappeared, you cannot use that black hole to time travel back in time in order to see the dinosaurs. You can only go back as far as the black hole's creation, which was after the dinosaurs. We call this a closed time loop, or as science hippies like to call it, a closed time-like curve. Now you might be wondering why all of this space-time shenanigan nonsense matters. And it matters because prophecies are just predictions for the future. And since it appears that a hollow has the properties of a black hole in the sense that they can create closed time-like curves that allow you to time travel to an extent, then you could theoretically use hollows to witness the events of the future, at least as far into the future as the hollow continues to exist. And if we consider the fact that we're working with a faction that's based on a prophet-centric religion, aka Christianity, and that this faction is associated with a mission titled The Prophecy, wherein the prophet is trying to ensure that the future that they envision comes to pass, then I can't help but think that that's what we're dealing with here. A faction that's trying to ensure a very specific future comes to pass. One that they saw when they traveled into the hollow. And I also think that there are some secret factions that are trying to run counter to the Exaltist Order, and that's why we have Fairy. Because if the Exaltist Order is about ensuring that a certain future comes to pass, then this new unnamed faction is trying to manipulate the past so that that future does not come to pass. And yes, this has to do with Fairy, because see, when we first encounter Fairy, whichever sibling that you chose as Phaethon has this vision of sorts, and it's unclear if this is the past or the future, but the text that keeps popping up on screen is rewind, like we're needing to go back in time to prevent a certain future causality, perhaps one brought upon by a prophecy. And the funny thing is, using a hollow to go back in time is already a concept in the game. There's this legend that's mentioned in the Night of the Hollow Passage collectible set that you get from Hollow Zero that talks about a mysterious crystal door, probably one made of ether crystals, that can be found in the depths of Hollow Zero that allows anyone to travel back in time. Which is probably gonna come in pretty handy, because I'm starting to wonder if Carole Arna was not only aware that this time travel stuff was possible, but also wanted to ensure that Belle and Wise would be able to achieve time travel, either to prevent the eruption of Hollow Zero in the first place, or so that they could at least see the truth for themselves and prevent future disasters. And if you can't tell by the way I'm talking, I don't think that Carole Arna actually caused the eruption. I do think she saw it coming, but I also think she couldn't stop it. And you know why I'm so confident that she's innocent? No? Well, let me ask you this then. What affects the size of a hollow? If you answered the amount of ether it contains, you are correct. And do note that ether is generated when a hollow consumes organic matter, which is exactly why Eridu's leaders had to detonate the Sheiyu pillars. The detonation around Hollow Zero not only created the chasm, but it also destroyed all organic matter in the vicinity, and that prevented the hollow from further expanding. But the thing is, sentient life forms have a much greater impact on the amount of ether generated within a hollow than non-sentient matter. That's why killing powerful ethereals, or a lot of weaker ones, can cause a hollow to shrink. Ethereals are corrupted sentient life forms. But if getting rid of ethereals makes a hollow shrink, then creating ethereals should cause a hollow to grow. And if sentient life forms have a greater impact on hollow size, then isn't it plausible that Hollow Zero erupted because it received a sudden influx of sentient life forms? And could it be that those life forms were actually followers of the Exaltist Order? After all, we had this hollow worshipping order rallying near Hollow Zero mere days before the eruption. So is it not possible that this rally was actually more of a ceremony, one where they would offer themselves to the hollow? As for why they would do this, belief is an incredibly powerful force, and it can be easily turned into a weapon in the wrong hands. So in my eyes, it's very easy to see a situation where an Exaltist Overseer entices people with some kind of prophecy. If they're able to see the future within a hollow, then they could lure them in saying, hey look, I just made a prophecy, it turned out correct. Look, I made another prophecy, this one's also correct. You should trust me, I know the future. You're safe with me. This creates a perfect situation where blind faith is encouraged and easy. And in a way, that makes these people sacrifices, or rather, sacrificial lambs. By offering themselves to the hollow, they are basically giving their lives for the perceived greater good. Now, I think finding any kind of evidence of this would be more than enough to clear Carole Arna's name, unless she's one of them. And with that, I am done speculating. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.